Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. I never thought a simple fence would spark a war. When the HOA tore it down, claiming a right they didn't have, they didn't expect me to fight back. But this land was my father's legacy, and they were about to learn just how far I'd go to protect it. I never thought the land my father left me would become the center of such a ridiculous battle. My name's Jackson Hale, but everyone just calls me Jack. I'm 39, an engineer by trade, and I've always been the kind of guy who prefers tinkering with gadgets in the garage to mingling with the neighbors. The 5 acres I inherited sit right on the edge of Sunset Valley, a place ruled by a homeowners association that I've never had the pleasure of joining and never intended to. The old house my dad built stands sturdy at the center of the lot, surrounded by tall oaks and thick pines, their shadows stretching long across the yard by late afternoon. A worn but solid wooden fence runs along the property line, marking a clear boundary between my world and the neatly trimmed lawns of Sunset Valley. That fence had been standing for decades, a quiet reminder of where our independence began and their rules ended. Dad used to call it our castle wall, and I suppose, in a way, I've always thought of it like that too. Life here had been peaceful. I spent my days restoring the old barn, working on solar panels for the roof, and keeping the fence in decent shape. I liked the solitude, the freedom to decide what got built, what stayed wild, what belonged only to me. I didn't care much for the neighborhood gossip or the HOA's endless letters that sometimes landed in my mailbox by mistake. But that peace shattered one morning, just as the sun was cutting through the treetops. I'd gone out with a mug of coffee to check the yard, only to find a gaping hole in the fence near the back edge of the property. Several boards were splintered, the posts cracked, and deep tire tracks scarred the grass, leading straight through the breach and back toward the paved road on the other side. And right there, nailed to one of the broken posts, was a gleaming metal sign. Planned Access Point, Sunset Valley HOA. I stood there for a long moment, my coffee growing cold in my hand. An access point. Across my land. My jaw tightened as I surveyed the damage, already knowing whose fingerprints were all over this. And sure enough, as if summoned by the sheer absurdity of it, I heard footsteps approaching from the other side. "Good morning, Jack," came a clipped, confident voice. I turned to see her, Karen, the newly elected president of the Sunset Valley HOA. She was dressed in business casual, clipboard in hand, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'd met her once at a town event, but she hadn't bothered to hide her distaste for outliers like me, folks who didn't belong to her tidy little world. She gestured toward the breach, her tone breezy. "We've been discussing plans for a pedestrian path connecting the cul-de-sac to the park. It's been on the community improvement agenda for months. Looks like the crew got a head start on clearing the space." I frowned. "That crew tore down my fence. This is private property." She tilted her head, feigning surprise. "Oh, Jack, I think there's been a misunderstanding. That fence's placement has always been questionable. The records show a shared easement along this boundary. We're just reclaiming community access. No need to make a fuss." I stepped closer, meeting her gaze. "That fence has been here since my father built it. And this land's been in my family since before Sunset Valley even existed. There's no easement, no access, and no shared anything." Karen's smile tightened, her voice lowering just enough to hint at steel beneath the politeness. "We'll see about that." And with that, she turned, her clipboard swinging at her side as she strode back toward the HOA's perfectly manicured realm. I watched her go, my stomach sinking with the uneasy feeling that this was only the opening move. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of hammering. At first, I thought it was just the echo of some neighbor's home improvement project drifting across the woods. But the rhythm was too close, too deliberate. I pulled on a jacket, stepped onto the porch, and felt my chest tighten. There they were. 3 men in yellow vests, each stamped with the HOA's emblem, standing by the damaged section of my fence. One held a crowbar, another was prying loose more boards, and a third was tossing the broken planks onto a growing pile like firewood. My fence, my father's fence, was coming down, board by board, under their hands. "Hey!" I shouted, stomping across the yard. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The man with the crowbar paused, straightened up, and turned to me with a casual shrug. "Work order from the HOA, sir. We're clearing the access path." I stopped at the edge of the wreckage, fists clenched. "You're trespassing on private property. That fence is legally mine." Behind me, I heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. Karen's voice floated over, cool as ever. "Jack, You really shouldn't raise your voice at people just doing their jobs." I spun around. There she was, clipboard in hand again, lips curled in that infuriatingly pleasant smile. "They're not doing their jobs," I snapped. "They're tearing down my fence." She sighed, as if I were an obstinate child refusing to eat his vegetables. "Jack, you have to understand, this path is for the good of the community. The plans have been approved, and according to our records, the fence encroaches onto a designated easement." I pulled out my phone, pulling up the scanned copy of my property deed. "No easement. Look, my boundary is clearly marked. This land is mine, all the way to the old survey markers." Karen took a step closer, peering at the screen as if humoring me. "I'll have to review those documents," she said smoothly. But in the meantime, the association's work needs to continue." I could feel the heat rising in my face. "The association has no jurisdiction over my land. I'm not part of Sunset Valley. You don't get to decide what happens here." She tapped her clipboard thoughtfully, as if weighing her next move. "Jack, I'd really hate for this to escalate unnecessarily. Why don't you let the process play out? I'm sure the city will side with us once everything's reviewed." The way she said it, calm, assured, almost smug, sent a ripple of dread down my spine. This wasn't just an HOA president on a power trip. There was strategy here, an endgame I hadn't yet seen. The workers kept pulling at the fence, and I stepped back, filming everything on my phone. "You're going to regret this," I told her quietly. Karen's smile only widened. "We'll see." By the end of the day, nearly 20 feet of fence lay in ruins, replaced by nothing but a line of orange stakes driven into the soil. When the men finally packed up and left, they left behind splinters, wheel ruts, and the bitter scent of fresh-cut wood. I stood at the edge of my yard, staring at the exposed gap, the shadows of Sunset Valley's tidy homes stretching long across my land. I called the county sheriff's office that night, filing an official complaint for trespassing and destruction of property. An officer came by to take photos and statements, nodding sympathetically as I explained the situation. "Sounds like a mess," he said, jotting notes in his little pad. "But without a court order or clear criminal intent, this'll probably get pushed to civil court. You might want to get a lawyer involved." I already had. My attorney had been with the family for years, a quiet, meticulous woman named Linda. She called me that night after reviewing the photos and documents I sent. "Jack, keep documenting everything," she said. "Take videos, photos, save every letter they send. They're trying to establish a claim through action. But we'll fight this." I hung up and stared out the window at the broken fence, wondering just how far Karen was willing to go. A few days passed in uneasy silence. I rebuilt the broken section of the fence as best I could, though it didn't match the weathered boards my father had used decades ago. Every hammer strike echoed with frustration. I added new private property signs along the fence line, bold and impossible to miss, hoping maybe, just maybe, it would make them think twice. But hope doesn't stand a chance against people like Karen. That Thursday, I pulled into my driveway after a long day at work and immediately noticed something off. Parked at the far end of my property beyond the fence line were 2 SUVs and a pickup truck, each emblazoned with the HOA's logo on the doors. And stretching across my yard, starting from the road that bordered Sunset Valley, was a line of orange survey flags. They cut straight through my land like a scar, ignoring the natural property boundaries entirely. I got out of the truck, heart pounding, and walked toward the flags. A few men in hard hats milled around, unfurling measuring tapes, hammering more stakes into the ground. One held a rolled-up blueprint, spreading it across the hood of a vehicle. "Excuse me," I called out. "What the hell is going on?" A man looked up from the plans. "We're prepping the site for the new pathway. Work's scheduled to start next week." I froze. "What pathway?" He pointed to the stakes like it was obvious. "Community Pedestrian Path. HOA Directive." Before I could fire back, I heard that familiar click of heels on gravel. Karen appeared beside the men, her arms crossed, lips pursed in a smile that barely masked satisfaction. "Jack," she said sweetly, "I was hoping to catch you today. I see you've met the survey team." I stepped closer, keeping my voice even. "You have no right to mark anything on my land. Those stakes are trespassing." She tilted her head, mock sympathy bleeding into her tone. "Jack, I understand you're upset, but this path has been on the HOA's master plan for years. It's meant to connect our neighborhood to the public park. It's for the good of everyone." I clenched my jaw. "This isn't HOA land." She gave a delicate shrug. That's debatable. According to some older maps our council obtained, there's historical precedent for a shared easement here. I stared at her. What maps? We're happy to provide copies through formal channels, she replied. But in the meantime, the preparations will continue. We're on a tight timeline. Behind her, more workers drove additional stakes into the soil. My soil. It felt surreal, like I was watching a slow-moving invasion, each tap of the hammer claiming more ground. Get off my property, I said, louder now. All of you. Karen's smile hardened. I'm afraid I can't do that. This is association business. I pulled out my phone again, filming every angle. The stakes, the vehicles, the workers. Karen standing like a queen, surveying her conquest. Then I'll see you in court, I told her. She barely blinked. Oh, I'll look forward to it. By the time they left that evening, my yard looked like a construction site. The survey flags snaked across the grass in a neat, defiant line. I stood in the fading light, feeling the weight of their audacity settle heavy on my chest. Linda called after I sent her the footage. They're laying groundwork for a claim, she warned. They'll argue that you allowed access by not objecting sooner. Every flag they leave, every minute they stand there, they're building their narrative. I rubbed a hand over my face. So, what do I do? Don't touch the stakes yet, she advised. But document everything. We'll need undeniable proof when we take this to court. And Jack, consider hiring someone to help dig into their paperwork. Something feels off. I hung up and stared at the mess outside. Karen wasn't just trying to push a pathway through. She was pushing me out. And somehow, I knew. This wasn't just about a sidewalk. The next few days felt like walking on a battlefield. Every time I looked out my window, those orange stakes stared back at me like a challenge, a silent reminder that the HOA wasn't backing down. I made sure to photograph them from every angle, time-stamping each shot, logging every interaction. Linda insisted on it. They're counting on you losing your cool, she'd said. Don't give them ammunition. But no matter how calm I tried to stay, the pit in my stomach kept growing. Karen hadn't come back in person since the day they staked the land. That worried me more than if she'd been hovering around. It meant she was busy somewhere else, moving chess pieces I couldn't see. Then, one evening, Linda called with a tone I hadn't heard before, a mixture of excitement and caution. Jack, I've found someone who might be able to help. Old friend from law school turned private investigator. She specializes in land disputes and municipal records. I had her pull the property files. My heart skipped. And she found discrepancies, Linda said. The county's online map shows your boundary exactly where your deed says it is. But the HOA submitted different maps for their pathway plan, maps that conveniently push your line back by about 30 feet. I leaned forward, gripping the phone. They forged it? Not exactly forged, she said carefully. But they're using a survey from 20 years ago that was never officially filed with the county. It was part of a proposed subdivision plan that fell through. That map was invalidated when the project was scrapped, but it looks like Karen's been waving it around as proof of an old easement. I let out a low whistle. So it's bogus. Legally? Absolutely. But if no one checks, it's enough to convince a city planner who doesn't dig deeper, especially with her pulling strings on the HOA board. I rubbed my forehead, anger and relief swirling in equal measure. Can we use this? We're going to, Linda said firmly, but I need more. We need to prove she knew it was invalid, and that she's using her position to mislead the board and the city. That's when the investigator, her name was Dana, spoke up on the call. Jack, mind if I poke around the HOA office? They're supposed to keep public records available to members. I've got a contact who can get me inside during their open hours. Do it, I said. Whatever it takes. The next day, Dana went digging while I stayed home, watching the survey flags flutter in the breeze. By evening, she sent me a photo that made my pulse jump. It was a scanned email between Karen and a local developer, subject line, Pathway Easement Proposal. In the message, Karen wrote, if we can push the access path through his lot, we'll secure a direct route to the commercial site. I'll handle the paperwork on the HOA end. Just keep it quiet until it's locked. I forwarded it to Linda without hesitation. Her reply was instant. We've got her. I woke up early the next morning to the unmistakable sound of engines rumbling outside. My heart dropped. I threw on a jacket, grabbed my phone, and stepped onto the porch. What I saw made my blood run cold. A line of trucks and heavy equipment was parked along the edge of my property, Workers in bright vests were unloading tools, hauling concrete posts, and stacking rebar. At the head of the group stood Karen, clipboard in hand, barking orders like a general on the front line. They were building. On Myersirius land. I stormed across the yard, recording everything on my phone. "Hey!" I shouted as I approached. "Get those trucks off my property right now!" Karen turned, flashing that same infuriating smile. "Jack, I told you this was happening. Today we're installing the foundation for the pathway. It's all been approved." "Approved by who?" I demanded. "Not the county, not the courts, and definitely not me." She held up a printed document, waving it in front of me like a trophy. "A resolution passed by the HOA board. We've asserted community interest under easement law. This is happening." "You don't have the authority," I growled. "This is trespassing. Every inch of this is illegal." Karen's smile thinned. "Then call the cops, Jack. See how far that gets you." I did. I dialed 911 right there, watching as the workers started digging trenches along the flagged line. But I knew what the operator would say. "Civil matter," they'd tell me. "Take it up with the courts." It was the same wall I'd hit every time. I hung up, frustration boiling in my chest, and walked straight up to one of the workers who'd begun driving a post into the soil near my barn. "You need to stop," I ordered, my voice sharp. The man looked at me, shrugged, and swung the sledgehammer down again. I reached out, grabbing the handle mid-swing to stop him. I said stop. Big mistake. He yanked the hammer back, twisting it out of my grip and nearly knocking me off balance. "Don't touch my tools, buddy," he warned. I straightened, fists clenched. "You're breaking the law. Every minute you're here is another crime." Karen strode up behind me, her voice slicing through the air. "Jack, step back. You're interfering with authorized work." "Authorize my ass," I snapped, spinning to face her. She stepped closer, invading my space, her expression turning steely. "I warned you, you're standing in the way of progress. The community will thank me for this." Before I could reply, the worker behind me shoved me hard in the shoulder, sending me stumbling forward. Instinct took over. I turned, swinging my arm to block him as he raised the hammer again. The handle cracked against my forearm, pain shooting up my elbow, but I managed to grab it with both hands, twisting it free. The next moment was chaos. He lunged. I sidestepped, shoving him off balance. Karen screamed something unintelligible as more workers rushed toward us. A sharp whistle cut through the noise. Police sirens blared in the distance, getting closer. Someone must have called them again. Maybe a neighbor, maybe Karen herself, hoping to spin the story her way. The worker backed off as two patrol cars skidded onto the property. Officers jumped out, hands raised. "Everyone stand down," one barked. I dropped the hammer immediately, stepping back with my hands open. "I'm the property owner," I said breathlessly. "They're trespassing." Karen rushed forward, face flushed with righteous indignation. "Officer, he assaulted my crew. He attacked them without provocation." The officer looked between us, glancing at the growing crowd of workers, the half-dug trenches, the concrete posts littering my yard. His partner approached me carefully. "Sir, do you have proof of ownership?" "I do." I pulled out my phone, flipping to the deed I'd kept saved for exactly this reason. "And I've been documenting everything." The first officer gestured toward Karen. "We're going to need everyone's statements. For now, everyone back up. Nobody's moving another shovel until we sort this out." Karen glared at me, her hands tightening into fists at her sides. "This isn't over, Jack." No, it wasn't. But for the first time, I felt like the tide had shifted, and I wasn't going down without a fight. The police left that afternoon after taking statements from everyone involved. They didn't arrest anyone, not yet, but the officer handed me a card before pulling away. "If you get more documents, more proof, send them directly to me," he said. "This isn't normal HOA business." That small acknowledgement gave me the faintest sliver of hope, but Karen wasn't slowing down. The very next morning, an official-looking envelope landed in my mailbox. Inside was a formal notice from the Sunset Valley HOA, citing a violation of community access obligations and demanding that I cease interference with designated public improvements. It was signed by Karen herself, stamped with their ridiculous logo, and threatened escalating penalties for every day I refused to comply. I handed the letter to Linda that afternoon. She read it silently, then snorted. "She's bluffing," she said, "but she's laying the groundwork for a bigger play." "What kind of play?" I asked. Linda tapped the letter thoughtfully. She's going to the city council, probably arguing that the HOA has authority to enforce this so-called easement. If she convinces them, they could pressure the planning commission to approve her plans retroactively. That's not legal, I said. No, Linda agreed, but it doesn't have to be legal. It just has to look legitimate long enough for her to get the permits pushed through. Sure enough, that evening, I opened my email to find a forwarded notice from the city clerk, an agenda for the next council meeting. Item Circular 7, Review of Sunset Valley HOA's proposed pedestrian access easement and pathway project. My land, my fight, now up for public debate. I paced the kitchen, rereading the email, every nerve in my body vibrating. She's trying to make this official before we can stop it. We'll stop it, Linda promised, but we need evidence. Hard proof that she knows the easement isn't real. I called Dana, the investigator, relaying everything. Can you get inside her files again? Already ahead of you, she replied. I've got a contact on the HOA board who's not exactly Karen's biggest fan. She's willing to leak internal memos. By the next day, Dana delivered. A folder of scanned documents, each one more damning than the last. Emails between Karen and the developer discussing kickbacks if the pathway cleared. Notes from a private HOA meeting where Karen admitted the map was technically invalid, but practically enforceable. A draft press release bragging about negotiated community improvements that would increase adjacent property values, all signed by Karen. Linda's voice crackled through the speaker as we reviewed the files. Jack, this is bigger than a fence. This is fraud, abuse of office, possibly embezzlement if those kickbacks trace to HOA funds. I stared at the documents, a cold rage settling deep in my chest. What do we do now? We go public, Linda said. We file an injunction to halt the project, and we take every one of these documents to the DA's office. As if sensing the shift, my phone buzzed with a new message from Karen. Jack, I hope we can resolve this amicably. There's still time to come to the table. I stared at her words, a bitter laugh rising in my throat. Not a chance. Linda wasted no time. By the end of the week, she'd drafted an emergency injunction to halt all construction activities on my land. We filed it with the county court first thing Monday morning. I stood beside her in the courthouse lobby, watching her pass the stack of paperwork to the clerk, with a quiet confidence that steadied me. This'll put everything on pause while the court reviews the facts, she explained as we left. At least it buys us breathing room. It wasn't long before the court issued a temporary restraining order against the HOA. By mid-afternoon, a sheriff's deputy showed up at my property with official documents, posting the injunction on a wooden stake near the torn-up fence line. The workers who'd been lingering around with clipboards and idle equipment were forced to pack up and leave, shooting me dirty looks as they drove away. But I knew Karen wouldn't let that be the end. Sure enough, the next day my phone buzzed with an email from the city council. Karen had presented new evidence at an emergency meeting, urging the council to recognize the easement and override the injunction. Her argument hinged on those old invalidated maps dressed up as historical surveys. I forwarded the email to Linda, who replied within minutes. We'll counter that. But it's time to go bigger. She filed a civil lawsuit against Karen personally and the HOA as an entity. Trespass, destruction of property, harassment, abuse of office. She attached every piece of evidence Dana had uncovered. The emails, the fake maps, the secret meeting notes. We were no longer just defending my fence. We were accusing Karen of orchestrating an illegal land grab for personal gain. The lawsuit hit the HOA like a thunderclap. That afternoon, Dana called me, barely able to contain her excitement. They're scrambling, she said. Karen called an emergency board meeting this morning. My contact says half the board members are furious. They didn't know the maps were fake. Some are already talking about resigning. I leaned back in my chair, letting out a slow breath. Good. But the battle wasn't won yet. Karen fought back hard. She hired a high-profile real estate attorney from the city, the kind of lawyer who liked to drown opponents in paperwork. Within days, they filed a motion to dismiss, claiming I had no standing to sue since the HOA was acting in the public interest. They argued that any mistakes in the easement filings were good faith errors and not actionable fraud. Linda wasn't fazed. We expected this, she told me. They're trying to delay, stall, exhaust you. I'm not giving up, I said. I know. She smiled faintly. Neither am I. Meanwhile, Dana uncovered something even juicier, a financial trail linking Karen's personal bank account to deposits from a shell company tied to the developer. It wasn't just about the pathway anymore. Karen had been positioning the HOA to approve a lucrative rezoning deal with the developer, which would skyrocket adjacent property values and net her a tidy payout under the table. Linda's voice hardened when she saw the records. "Jack, this moves us into criminal territory." I felt a surge of adrenaline. "So what's next?" "We send this to the district attorney," she said, "and we push for criminal charges." For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself a genuine smile. The fence was never just a fence, and Karen was about to learn that the wall she tried to tear down was stronger than she'd ever imagined. When the trial finally began, it felt surreal sitting in that courtroom. The polished wood, the smell of old paper, the distant hum of the overhead lights. It was a different battlefield entirely, but the stakes felt just as high. Karen sat at the defendant's table, flanked by her high-powered attorney and a junior associate who barely looked old enough to vote. She didn't look at me, not once, not even when our eyes accidentally aligned. Her gaze stayed fixed on her lawyer's notes, her jaw tight, her posture stiff. For all her smug confidence on my land, here she looked. Smaller. Linda stood beside me as we watched the jury file in. "We've got a strong case," she whispered. "The evidence speaks for itself. We just need to connect the dots clearly." The prosecution opened with a steady, methodical presentation. Emails, maps, financial records. Each piece of evidence landed like a stone in a growing pile. The jury leaned forward as they listened to Karen's own words, projected on a large screen at the front of the courtroom. The email to the developer, her meeting notes calling the map technically invalid, the draft press releases promising a community benefit that masked her personal gain. When I took the stand, I told them everything. I described the morning I found the hole in my fence, the creeping expansion of those survey flags, the trucks and workers invading my yard. I recounted the day she stood in my field and told me to let the process play out. I showed them the video from the day of the scuffle, the police arriving, the injunction pinned to the fence post. "Why did you fight back?" her attorney asked me on cross-examination. "Because it wasn't just a fence," I said quietly. "It was my line, my family's line, and they tried to erase it." The jury watched silently as the prosecutor walked them through the financial trail Dana had uncovered. A check written from the developer's shell company to Karen's personal account, wire transfers, private meeting memos. Slowly, the picture filled in, a deliberate scheme to abuse HOA power for profit. Karen finally took the stand in her own defense, voice calm but shaky. She blamed her staff, blamed bad advice from a consultant. She insisted she never meant harm, never intended to deceive. But every denial unraveled under cross-examination, every excuse contradicted by her own signatures, her own emails. And when the prosecutor played the final recording, her voice on speakerphone telling the developer, "Don't worry, I'll push it through no matter what," I watched the last bit of color drain from her face. The courtroom was silent. Linda leaned closer. "They're with us," she murmured. And for the first time in months, I felt the weight start to lift. The courtroom felt heavier the day the verdict was read. Every seat was filled. Neighbors, reporters, city officials, even a few familiar faces from the HOA board who hadn't dared show up during the trial. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Linda, fingers tapping anxiously against the polished wood. Across the aisle, Karen sat stiffly between her lawyers, her expression frozen, pale and tight. The jury filed in, their faces solemn. The foreperson stood, paper in hand, voice steady but flat. "On the charge of trespass, guilty. On the charge of destruction of property, guilty. On the charge of abuse of office, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty." Each word hit like a drumbeat, final and undeniable. I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the weight of it settle into my chest. Linda squeezed my arm gently. Karen didn't move. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze fixed on some invisible point beyond the bench. Even her attorney looked resigned, slouched slightly in his chair. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "Ms. Johnson, please rise for sentencing." Karen stood slowly, hands clenched at her sides. The judge's voice was calm but firm. "Given the overwhelming evidence presented, including financial records, personal correspondence, and testimony from multiple witnesses, this court finds that you deliberately abused your position as president of the Sunset Valley HOA to pursue personal financial gain at the expense of your community and neighboring property owners. He paused, glancing toward me briefly before continuing. "You're hereby sentenced to 15 years in state prison, a fine of $500,000, and forfeiture of any proceeds obtained through these illicit actions. You are also barred from holding any position of authority in a homeowners association or related entity for the remainder of your life." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. I heard whispers, the faint shuffle of feet as people shifted in their seats. Karen's knees buckled slightly and she gripped the table for support. This is insane," she muttered under her breath. "This wasn't supposed to happen." The bailiff stepped forward, handcuffs at the ready. "Ma'am." Karen turned toward her attorney in desperation, but he only shook his head silently. As the bailiff secured the cuffs around her wrists, Karen finally looked at me, really looked for the first time since this all began. Her eyes were hollow, searching, maybe even pleading, but I had nothing left to give her. As they led her away, the murmurs grew louder. Reporters scrambled toward the hallway. Neighbors exchanged quiet glances, some shaking their heads, others whispering relief. Linda gathered her files, standing beside me. "It's done," she said softly. I nodded, though it didn't quite feel real yet. The fight was over. The line had held. And Karen. Karen was finally gone. 6 months later, the land was quiet again. The construction stakes were long gone. The broken fence had been replaced with new cedar panels, tall and strong, stretching the full length of the boundary line. I'd spent weeks rebuilding it by hand, each board measured, sanded, sealed. It wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a statement, a promise, a line no one would cross again. The HOA sent a formal letter of apology, signed by the interim president. They admitted no legal fault, of course, but the words were there. Regret, acknowledgement, commitment to transparency. I filed it away without ceremony. Words couldn't undo what had been done, but they were better than silence. The neighborhood felt different now. I noticed fewer suspicious glances when I drove past. Some of the neighbors even waved. One evening, as I was working on the front gate, a couple stopped by, Mike and Angela from the edge of Sunset Valley. "We're glad you stood up to her," Angela said quietly. "Most of us, we didn't know how far she'd gone." "You're welcome to come by any time," I told them. "The gate's not just to keep people out, it's to keep the right people in." They smiled, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the faint beginnings of trust rebuilding between my world and theirs. The settlement came through a few weeks later, $300,000 in damages. Linda handled the paperwork, the filings, the quiet victory. She told me I could have pushed for more, dragged it out longer, but I didn't want to. I wasn't in it for the money. I was in it to draw the line and make it stay. I used some of the funds to install security cameras, solar-powered lights along the fence, a reinforced gate with a discreet keypad lock. But most of the land I left as it had always been. Open meadows, groves of trees, the old barn weathered but standing proud. That summer, I threw a barbecue. Not a big one, just a few neighbors, Linda, Dana, Mike, and Angela, a couple of others who'd shown quiet support along the way. We set up tables under the trees, grilled burgers and ribs, shared beers, and quiet laughter. The sound of music drifted through the yard, mixing with the hum of cicadas. Someone pointed at the new sign I'd mounted above the gate. Private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Last person who tried, 15 years. They laughed, raising their drinks in a mock salute. I sat back in a lawn chair, sipping cold beer, watching the fireflies blink against the night sky. For the first time in over a year, I felt peace settle into the bones of the land again. I'd always called it my little kingdom. Now it finally felt like home.